In the scorching summer of 1388, across the windswept grasslands of the Mongolian steppe, two armies prepared for a confrontation that would reshape the destiny of East Asia. On one side stood the remnants of the mighty Yuan dynasty, the heirs of Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan, clinging desperately to their ancestral homeland. On the other side marched an army unlike any the steppe had ever seen, 150,000 Ming soldiers who had crossed the deadly Gobi Desert in pursuit of their enemies. What followed at the shores of Buir Lake was not merely a battle, but the death blow to an empire that had once stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe. The story of how the Ming crushed the Yuan begins not with the clash of armies, but with the rise of a beggar who would become emperor. In the chaos of the 14th century, as plague and famine ravaged China under Mongol rule, a young orphan named Zhu Yuanjiang wandered the countryside, sometimes begging for scraps, sometimes seeking shelter in Buddhist monasteries. Few could have imagined that this homeless youth would one day command the largest military force on earth and drive the descendants of Genghis Khan back into the wilderness from which they came. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan in 1271, had ruled China for nearly a century, but by the 1352, their grip was weakening. Natural disasters struck repeatedly. The Yellow River changed course, flooding vast regions and displacing millions. Epidemics swept through cities, leaving corpses rotting in the streets. The Mongol rulers, grown soft and corrupt after generations of Chinese luxury, proved incapable of responding to these crises. Peasant rebellions erupted across the empire, the most significant being the Red Turban Rebellion, which would ultimately topple the dynasty. Into this maelstrom stepped Zhu Yuanzhang. In 1352, he joined a rebel army, quickly distinguishing himself not just as a warrior, but as a leader who understood the suffering of common people. His humble origins became his strength, for he knew intimately the hardships that drove ordinary Chinese to revolt against their Mongol overlords. By 1356, he had conquered the great city of Nanjing, establishing it as his capital and declaring his intention to drive out the foreign invaders who had subjugated his people. The transformation was remarkable. The beggar monk became a general, then a prince, and finally in 1368, the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty. Taking the reign name Hongwu, meaning vastly martial, he set about creating not just a new government, but a new vision of Chinese civilization. Where the Yuan had been foreign rulers imposing their will on a conquered population, the Ming would be authentically Chinese, purging the land of what they called barbarian influences while restoring the glory of ancient Chinese culture. But declaring independence was one thing, achieving it was another. The Mongols might have lost China proper, but they had not vanished. Led by Tögüs Temür, the last Yuan emperor, they retreated to their ancestral homeland on the Mongolian steppe, establishing what historians call the Northern Yuan dynasty. From their new capital at Karakorum, they plotted their return, sending raiding parties across the Great Wall and maintaining diplomatic contacts with Mongol sympathizers still living within Chinese territory. The Hongwu emperor understood that his dynasty would never be secure as long as the Yuan remnants existed. A paranoid ruler shaped by years of struggle and betrayal, he saw threats everywhere. The Mongols represented not just a military danger, but an existential challenge to his legitimacy. If they could reclaim even a portion of their former empire, it would prove that the Ming were merely another temporary dynasty, not the restoration of eternal Chinese civilization that Hongwu claimed to represent. To eliminate this threat, the emperor began assembling one of the largest military forces in human history. His standing army exceeded 1 million troops, supported by naval dockyards in Nanjing that were the largest in the world. This was not merely an army, but a war machine designed for one purpose: the complete destruction of Mongol power. Yet the emperor faced a fundamental challenge. How do you defeat an enemy that refuses to stand and fight? The Mongols were masters of mobility warfare. Each soldier maintained 3 or 4 horses, rotating between them to maintain incredible speed across vast distances. Their composite bows could accurately hit targets at ranges exceeding 200 meters, while their cavalry tactics of feigned retreats and sudden flanking attacks had terrorized settled civilizations for centuries. When faced with superior forces, they simply melted away into the steppe, only to reappear when conditions favored them. Early Ming expeditions into Mongolia had learned this lesson painfully. In 1372, a massive Chinese army pursued the Yuan remnants deep into the grasslands, only to be defeated by Biligtu Khan Ayushiridara and his general Köke Temür. The Chinese discovered that their infantry formations and siege equipment, so effective in defending cities and fighting conventional battles, became liabilities in the open steppe where mobility was everything. But the Hongwu emperor was nothing if not persistent. If one approach failed, he would try another. Throughout the 1,370 seconds and 1,380 seconds, he launched a series of campaigns designed not to conquer Mongolia outright, but to systematically eliminate Mongol strongholds and reduce their capacity for organized resistance. Each expedition brought lessons that would be applied to the next. The breakthrough came with the rise of a general who understood both Chinese military organization and steppe warfare. Lan Yu had been born in Dingyuan, Anhui province, into a family with military connections. His elder sister married Chang Yuchun, one of the Hongwu emperor's most trusted generals, providing young Lan with opportunities to learn the art of war from masters of the craft. By the 1,370 seconds, he had proven himself in campaigns from Sichuan to the northern frontier, earning a reputation for tactical brilliance and personal courage. What set Lan Yu apart was his willingness to adapt Chinese military methods to steppe conditions. Traditional Chinese armies moved slowly, burdened by supply trains and siege equipment. Lan Yu developed techniques for rapid movement across difficult terrain, using captured intelligence to locate enemy forces and strike before they could escape. His victory over Köke Temür at the Tula River in 1372 demonstrated that Chinese forces could defeat Mongol cavalry when properly led and equipped. By the mid-1,380 seconds, the stage was set for a decisive confrontation. The Northern Yuan had consolidated around Tögüs Temür, who had claimed the title of Uskhal Khan and was attempting to rebuild Mongol unity under his leadership. From his power base near Buir Lake in northeastern Mongolia, he threatened to launch new invasions of Chinese territory, potentially undoing everything the Ming had accomplished. The emperor's response was characteristically thorough. Rather than launching another hasty expedition, he ordered careful preparation for what would be the largest military operation in Ming history. First, he dispatched General Feng Sheng to eliminate Mongol forces in Manchuria, removing potential threats to the main army's flanks. The campaign against the Uriankai chieftain Nagachu proved brilliantly successful, with the Mongol leader surrendering his entire force of over 80,000 warriors rather than face destruction. With Manchuria secured, the emperor turned to the main prize. In December 1387, he summoned Lan Yu to the Imperial palace and gave him the most important military command of his career. He was to lead an army of 150,000 men across the Gobi Desert, find Tögüs Temür wherever he might be hiding, and eliminate the Northern Yuan once and for all. The mission was simple to state but almost impossible to execute. The Mongols could be anywhere across thousands of square miles of desert and grassland, and they would certainly flee the moment they detected the approaching Chinese army. Lan Yu understood the magnitude of the challenge before him. Leading an army across the Gobi Desert was like navigating a sea of sand and stone where water was scarce, temperatures could kill, and a single miscalculation meant the death of thousands. The general spent months in preparation, studying maps drawn by traders and spies, gathering intelligence about water sources and seasonal weather patterns. This would not be a conventional campaign with supply lines and fortified bases. It would be a gamble with the lives of 150,000 men. The army that assembled at the Great Wall in early 1388 was a sight to behold. Disciplined infantry formations in quilted armor stood alongside cavalry units, trained specifically for desert warfare. Supply wagons carried concentrated rations and portable water containers, while scouts mounted on the hardiest horses prepared to range far ahead of the main force. These were not the pampered soldiers of a peaceful dynasty, but hardened veterans of frontier warfare, men who had learned to fight and survive in the harshest conditions imaginable. As spring approached, Lan Yu received disturbing intelligence from his network of spies. Tögüs Temür was indeed gathering forces near Buir Lake, but the Mongol Khan was confident that no Chinese army would dare venture so deep into the desert. The ruling class of the Northern Yuan believed the Ming troops would never risk such a treacherous march, especially with summer approaching when the desert heat could prove fatal to men unaccustomed to steppe conditions. This confidence would prove to be their undoing. In March 1388, Lan Yu gave the order to advance. The great army moved through the gates of Danning and Qingzhou like a steel serpent, disappearing into the vastness beyond the wall. Behind them lay the ordered world of Chinese civilization, with its rice paddies and walled cities. Ahead stretched an alien landscape of shifting sands and endless sky, where survival depended on discipline, endurance, and the favor of heaven. The march across the Gobi tested every man to his limits. During the day, temperatures soared until the metal of weapons became too hot to touch. At night, the desert cold cut through clothing and armor, leaving soldiers shivering in their bedrolls. Water became more precious than gold, strictly rationed and jealously guarded. Men began to hallucinate mirages, seeing lakes and cities that vanished as they approached. Some collapsed from heat exhaustion and had to be carried by their comrades. Others simply disappeared during night marches, swallowed by the endless darkness. Yet Lan Yu held his force together through sheer force of will and meticulous planning. He rotated units to prevent any single formation from bearing too much of the burden. He established a system of runners to maintain communication across the scattered columns. Most importantly, he shared the hardships of his men, marching on foot when horses were needed for supplies, drinking from the same rationed water sources, and sleeping under the same merciless stars. The psychological pressure was as brutal as the physical challenge. As days turned to weeks, and the army penetrated deeper into the trackless waste, doubt began to gnaw at even the most steadfast warriors. Were they pursuing ghosts across an empty desert? Had the Mongols already learned of their approach and fled to safer ground? The expedition was costing a fortune in resources and risking the lives of some of China's best soldiers on what might prove to be a futile chase across the steppes. By mid-May, after 2 months of grueling march, the army had covered over 500 miles from Beijing, pushing far beyond any previous Chinese expedition into Mongolia. They were now in a land where no Chinese emperor had ever set foot, where the very air seemed to whisper of ancient Mongol victories and the bones of forgotten armies. Some of Lan Yu's subordinates began to suggest retreat. They had demonstrated Chinese power by penetrating so deep into enemy territory. Perhaps it was time to return with honor intact, rather than risk disaster in pursuit of an elusive foe. But General Wang Bi, the Marquis of Dingyuan, spoke the words that changed history. Standing before Lan Yu in the command tent, surrounded by maps marked with uncertain positions and dwindling supply counts, he declared that it would be folly to return with such a massive army without achieving something meaningful. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back empty-handed. The emperor had entrusted them with the most important military mission of the dynasty. They must press on until they found their enemy or died in the attempt. Wang Bi's words electrified the command staff. These were not men accustomed to failure or retreat. They had conquered cities, defeated rebel armies, and carved out an empire from chaos. The desert might test their endurance, but it would not break their resolve. Lan Yu nodded grimly and gave orders to continue the advance. They would find Tögüs Temür, or they would perish in the attempt. The breakthrough came from the network of scouts that Lan Yu had deployed across the surrounding terrain. Despite the vast emptiness of the Gobi, trained eyes could read the landscape like a book. Tracks in the sand, trampled grass, the location of water sources, and the flight patterns of birds, all told stories to those who knew how to interpret them. On the night of May 17th, scouts reported that they had located the main Mongol encampment northeast of Buir Lake. The news spread through the Chinese ranks like wildfire. After months of hardship and uncertainty, they had finally found their quarry. But now came the most dangerous part of the entire operation. The Mongols were still unaware of the Chinese presence, but that advantage would disappear the moment they were spotted. Tögüs Temür commanded thousands of the finest cavalry in the world, warriors who could mount their horses and disappear into the steppe faster than any pursuing force could follow. Lan Yu made the decision that would define his place in history. Rather than risk a conventional approach that might alert the enemy, he would attack under cover of darkness and storm. A sandstorm had begun to blow across the desert, reducing visibility to mere yards and filling the air with stinging particles. Most commanders would have waited for better conditions, but Lan Yu recognized an opportunity. The same storm that hindered his army would also blind the Mongol sentries and muffle the sound of approaching troops. As night fell on May 17th, 150,000 Chinese soldiers began their final advance toward Buir Lake. They moved in absolute silence, guided by compass bearings and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the landscape. The sandstorm intensified, turning the world into a howling maelstrom of wind and grit. Men stumbled forward with cloth wrapped around their faces, trusting in their commanders and the soldiers beside them. The Mongol camp lay in peaceful slumber, unaware that death was approaching through the storm. Tögüs Temür and his nobles rested in their felt tents, confident in their scouts and the natural barriers that protected them. Their horses grazed peacefully nearby, while guards huddled against the wind and sand. None suspected that the largest Chinese army in history was moving through the darkness toward them, preparing to strike at dawn with the fury of a dynasty determined to eliminate its greatest enemy forever. Through the howling darkness, Lan Yu's massive army crept forward like a phantom across the desert floor. The sandstorm that had seemed like a curse now became their greatest ally, masking the sound of 150,000 men moving through the night. Horses snorted and stamped nervously, sensing the tension in their riders. Officers whispered final orders to their sergeants, who passed them down the line in hushed tones barely audible above the wind. Every soldier knew that dawn would bring either glorious victory or catastrophic defeat. As the first pale light began to creep across the eastern horizon, the storm began to subside. Through the thinning veils of sand and dust, the Chinese vanguard could make out the shapes of countless felt tents scattered across the grassland near the lake shore. Smoke rose from dying campfires where Mongol warriors had warmed themselves through the cold desert night. Herds of horses grazed peacefully in the distance, their bells jingling softly in the morning breeze. It was a scene of pastoral tranquility, about to be shattered by the fury of war. Lan Yu raised his hand, and across the desert, his signal was repeated by officers throughout the ranks. The moment had arrived. With a sound like distant thunder, the Ming army surged forward. Cavalry units on the flanks spread out to prevent escape, while the infantry advanced in disciplined formations, their spears glinting in the dawn light. War drums began to pound, their rhythm echoing off the surrounding hills and carrying across the water of Buir Lake. The effect on the Mongol camp was electric. Warriors stumbled from their tents half-dressed, grabbing for weapons and calling out in alarm. Horses reared and scattered as their herders tried desperately to control them. Women and children screamed as they realized an enemy army had appeared, as if from the earth itself. The Northern Yuan, masters of mobility and surprise attack, found themselves caught completely off guard by an enemy they had never expected to see. Tögüs Temür himself emerged from his royal pavilion, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. This was impossible. No Chinese army had ever penetrated so deep into Mongol territory. His scouts had reported nothing. His shamans had assured him that the spirits protected this sacred ground. Yet here were the banners of the Ming dynasty advancing across his homeland, carried by more soldiers than he had ever seen in one place. But the Mongol Khan was no coward. Despite the shock of the surprise attack, he began shouting orders to his commanders, attempting to organize some kind of resistance. Mongol warriors, trained from childhood for exactly this kind of crisis, began forming up around their leaders. Archers nocked arrows and sought elevated positions from which to shoot. Cavalry units that had managed to catch and mount their horses prepared for desperate charges against the advancing Chinese formations. Yet the mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Tögüs Temür commanded perhaps 20,000 warriors, caught scattered and unprepared. Lan Yu had brought 7 times that number, organized and ready for battle. The Mongols fought with the fury of cornered wolves, their curved sabers flashing as they carved into Chinese ranks. their arrows finding gaps in armor and shields. Individual acts of heroism blazed like stars across the battlefield as Mongol nobles led suicidal charges against impossible odds. The battle raged with a ferocity that seemed to shake the earth itself. Chinese infantry formations advanced like waves against rocky shores, breaking against fierce Mongol resistance only to reform and attack again. Cavalry clashed with cavalry in swirling melees that left the grass red with blood. Archers on both sides filled the air with deadly volleys that darkened the morning sky. The sound of clashing steel, screaming horses, and dying men echoed across the lake and into the surrounding hills. As the sun climbed higher, the inevitable began to unfold. Mongol resistance, heroic though it was, started to crumble under the sheer weight of numbers. Units that had fought with desperate courage found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. Warriors who had never known defeat in their lives fell beneath Chinese spears and swords. The proud banners of the Northern Yuan, symbols of an empire that had once ruled half the world, were trampled into the blood-soaked earth. The turning point came when Mongol General Karajan, leading a final desperate charge to break through the Chinese encirclement, was struck down by a forest of spears. His death seemed to break something in the Mongol ranks. Warriors who had fought like demons suddenly found themselves looking for escape routes rather than enemies to kill. The disciplined retreat that had saved Mongol armies for generations began to dissolve into something approaching panic. Tögüs Temür, realizing that the battle was lost, made the agonizing decision to save what could be saved. Surrounded by his personal guard, he fought his way through the chaos toward the northern edge of the battlefield, where a gap still existed in the Chinese lines. Behind him, he left his family, his treasures, and the dreams of restoring the Yuan dynasty to its former glory. The great Khan, who had claimed dominion over the steppes, fled like a hunted animal into the wilderness. But if Tögüs Temür escaped, almost everything else fell into Chinese hands. Lan Yu's disciplined troops swept through the Mongol camp like a tide, capturing anyone too slow or too wounded to flee. The haul was staggering in its scope. Hundreds of Mongol nobles, including members of Tögüs Temür's own family, were taken prisoner. Tens of thousands of ordinary Mongols, from warriors to craftsmen to herders, found themselves captives of the Ming army. The material wealth captured was beyond counting. Golden ornaments, silk robes, weapons inlaid with precious metals, and ceremonial objects that had been treasured for generations all fell into Chinese hands. More practically significant were the hundreds of thousands of horses, cattle, sheep, and camels that represented the mobile wealth of the steppe peoples. These animals alone were worth a fortune, but they also represented something more profound. They were the foundation of Mongol military power, the source of the mobility that had made them masters of Eurasia. Among the most precious captives were the imperial seals and documents that legitimized Yuan rule. These ancient artifacts, passed down from the time of Genghis Khan himself, were the symbols of Mongol authority over their scattered tribes and peoples. With these seals in Chinese hands, Tögüs Temür's claim to be the rightful heir of the great Khans became hollow. The spiritual and political foundation of Northern Yuan power had been shattered as completely as their military strength. As the sun reached its zenith over Buir Lake, the magnitude of the Chinese victory became clear. What had begun as a desperate gamble across the Gobi Desert had become one of the most complete military triumphs in history. An entire people, the inheritors of the greatest empire the world had ever known, lay broken and scattered across the grasslands of their homeland. The descendants of Genghis Khan, who had once made emperors tremble from Beijing to Baghdad, were now prisoners begging for mercy from Chinese soldiers. Yet even in the moment of triumph, Lan Yu understood the broader implications of what had occurred. This was not merely a military victory, but a transformation of the entire balance of power in East Asia. The Mongol threat that had haunted Chinese nightmares for over a century had been broken forever. Never again would the descendants of the great Khans be able to unite the steppe tribes under a single banner and threaten the civilized world. The psychological impact of the defeat rippled far beyond the battlefield itself. Across the vast expanses of the Mongolian plateau, tribal leaders who had maintained loyalty to the Northern Yuan began to reconsider their positions. If Tögüs Temür himself, with the best warriors of the steppes, could be so thoroughly defeated, what hope did smaller tribes have of resisting Chinese power? The aura of Mongol invincibility, carefully cultivated over generations of conquest, evaporated like morning mist in the desert Sunday. As Lan Yu organized his vast haul of prisoners and plunder for the long march back to China, he could not have known that he was witnessing the end of an era. The age of the great nomadic empires, which had shaped Eurasian history for over a millennium, was drawing to a close. The victory at Buir Lake marked the beginning of a new chapter in which settled agricultural civilizations would dominate the steppes rather than fear them. Thus ended the Northern Yuan dynasty, not with the grandeur of their ancestors' conquests, but in the dust and blood beside a remote lake in the Mongolian steppes. From the ashes of that defeat, the Ming would rule China for nearly 3 centuries, while the Mongols fragmented into scattered tribes, never again to threaten the civilized world as one people. The beggar who became emperor had achieved his ultimate victory, and the heirs of Genghis Khan learned that even the greatest empires must eventually face their final dawn.